they were kids as our family was, Chris Langan says. We didn't have a pair of matched socks. Our shoes had holes in them. Our pants had holes in them. We only had one set of clothes. I remember my brothers and I going to the bathroom and using the bathtub to wash our only set of clothes, and we were bare-ass naked when we were doing that because we didn't have anything else to wear. Jack Langan would go on drinking sprees and disappear. He would lock the kitchen cabinets so the boys couldn't get to the food. He used a bullwhip to keep the boys in line. He would get jobs and then lose them, moving the family on to the next town. One summer, the family lived on an Indian reservation in a teepee, subsisting on government surplus peanut butter and cornmeal. For a time, they lived in Virginia City, Nevada. There was only one law officer in town, and when the Hells Angels came to town, he would crouch down in the back of his office, Mark remembers. There was a bar there, I'll always remember. It was called the Bucket of Blood Saloon. When the boys were in grade school, the family moved to Bozeman, Montana. One of Chris's brothers spent time in a foster home. Another was sent to reform school. I don't think the school ever understood just how gifted Christopher was, his brother Jeff says. He sure as hell didn't play it up. This was Bozeman. It wasn't like it is today. It was a small hick town when we were growing up. We weren't treated well there. They just decided that my family was a bunch of deadbeats. To stick up for himself and his brothers, Chris started to lift weights. One day, when Chris was 14, Jack Langan got rough with the boys as he sometimes did, and Chris knocked him out cold. Jack left, never to return. Upon graduation from high school, Chris was offered 2 full scholarships, one to Reed College in Oregon and the other to the University of Chicago. He chose Reed. It was a huge mistake, Chris recalls. I had a real case of culture shock. I was a crew-cut kid who had been working as a ranch hand in the summers in Montana. And there I was with a whole bunch of long-haired city kids, most of them from New York. And these kids had a whole different style than I was used to. I couldn't get a word in edgewise in class. They were very inquisitive, asking questions all the time. I was crammed into a dorm room. There were 4 of us, and the other 3 guys had a whole different lifestyle. They were smoking pot. They would bring their girlfriends into the room. I'd never smoked pot before, so I basically took to hiding in the library. He continued, Then I lost that scholarship. My mother was supposed to fill out a parent's financial statement for the renewal of that scholarship. She neglected to do so. She was confused by the requirements or whatever. At some point, it came to my attention that my scholarship had not been renewed. So I went to the office to ask why, and they told me, well, no one sent us the financial statement, and we allocated all the scholarship money, and it's all gone, so I'm afraid that you don't have a scholarship here anymore. That was the style of the place. They simply didn't care. They didn't give a shit about their students. There was no counseling, no mentoring, nothing. Chris left Reed before the final set of exams. In the first semester, he had earned A's. In the second semester, he had F's. He went back to Bozeman and worked in construction as a Forest Services firefighter for a year and a half. Then he enrolled at Montana State University. I was taking math and philosophy courses, he recalled. And then in the winter quarter, I was living 13 miles out of town, out on Beach Hill Road, and the transmission fell out of my car. My brothers had used it when I was gone that summer. They were working for the railroad and had driven it on the railway tracks. I didn't have the money to repair it. So I went to the dean and my advisor in sequence, and I said, I have a problem. The transmission fell out of my car, and you have me in a 7:30 a.m. and 8:30 a.m. class. If you could please just transfer me to the afternoon sections of those classes, I would appreciate it because of this car problem. There was a neighbor who was a rancher who was going to take me in at 11 o'clock. My advisor was this cowboy-looking guy with a handlebar mustache dressed in a tweed jacket. He said, Well, son, after looking at your transcript at Reed College, I can see you have yet to learn that everyone has to make sacrifices to get an education. Request denied. So I went to the dean. Same treatment. His voice grew tight. He was describing things that had happened over 30 years ago, but the memory still made him angry. At that point I realized, here I was, knocking myself out to make the money to make my way back to school, and it's the middle of the Montana winter. I am willing to hitchhike into town every day, do whatever I had to do just to get into school and back, and they are unwilling to do anything for me. So bananas. And that was the point I decided I could do without the higher education system. Even if I couldn't do without it, it was sufficiently repugnant to me that I wouldn't do it anymore. So I dropped out of college. Simple as that. Chris Langen's experiences at Rita, Montana State represented a turning point in his life. As a child, he had dreamt of becoming an academic. He should have gotten a PhD. Universities are institutions structured in large part for people with his kind of deep intellectual interests and curiosity. Once he got into the university environment, I thought he would prosper. I really did, his brother Mark says. I thought he would somehow find a niche. It made absolutely no sense to me when he left that. Without a degree, Langen floundered. He worked in construction. One frigid winter, he worked on a clam boat in Long Island. He took factory jobs and minor civil service positions and eventually became a bouncer in a bar on Long Island, which was his principal occupation through much of his adult years. Through it all, he continued to read deeply in philosophy, mathematics, and physics as he worked on a sprawling treatise he calls the CTMU, the Cognitive Theoretical Model of the Universe. But without academic credentials, he despairs of ever getting published in a scholarly journal. I'm a guy who has a year and a half of college, he says with a shrug. And at some point this will come to the attention of the editor, as he's going to take the paper and send it off to the referees, and these referees are going to try and look me up, and they're not going to find me. And they're going to say, this guy has a year and a half of college. How can he know what he's talking about? It is a heartbreaking story. At one point I asked Langen whether he would take a job at Harvard University, hypothetically, were it offered to him. Well, that's a difficult question, he replied. Obviously, as a full professor at Harvard, I would count. My ideas would have weight, and I could use my position, my affiliation at Harvard, to promote my ideas. An institution like that is a great source of intellectual energy, and if I were at a place like that, I could absorb the vibration in the air. It was suddenly clear how lonely his life had been. Here he was, a man with an insatiable appetite for learning, forced for much of his adult life to live in intellectual isolation. I even noticed that kind of intellectual energy in the year and a half I was in college, he said, almost wistfully. Ideas are in the air constantly. It's such a stimulating place to be. On the other hand, he went on, Harvard is basically a glorified corporation, operating with a profit incentive. That's what makes it tick. It has an endowment in the billions of dollars. The people running it are not necessarily searching for truth and knowledge. They want to be big shots. And when you accept a paycheck from those people, it is going to come down to what you want to do and what you feel is right versus what the man says you can do to receive another paycheck. When you're there, they got a thumb right on you. They're right to make sure you don't step out of line. Is the 10,000-hour rule a general rule of success? If we scratch below the surface of every great achiever, do we always find the equivalent of the Michigan Computer Center or the hockey all-star team, some sort of special opportunity for practice? Let's test the idea with two examples. And for the sake of simplicity, let's make them as familiar as possible. The Beatles, one of the most famous rock bands ever, and Bill Gates, one of the world's richest men. The Beatles, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, came to the United States in February of 1964, starting the so-called British invasion of the American music scene and putting out a string of hit records that transformed the face of popular music. The first interesting thing about the Beatles, for our purposes, is how long they had already been together by the time they reached the United States. Lennon and McCartney first started playing together in 1957, 7 years prior to landing in America. Incidentally, the time that elapsed between their founding and their arguably greatest artistic achievements, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and the Beatles' White Album, is 10 years. And if you look even more closely at those long years of preparation, you'll find and experience that, in the context of hockey players and Bill Joy and world-class violinists, sounds awfully familiar. In 1960, while they were still a struggling high school rock band, the Beatles were invited to play in Hamburg, Germany. Hamburg in those days did not have rock and roll music clubs. It had strip clubs, says Philip Norman, who wrote the Beatles' biography, Shout. There was one particular club owner called Bruno, who was originally a fairground showman. He had the idea of bringing in rock groups to play in various clubs. They had this formula. It was a huge non-stop show, hour after hour, with a lot of people lurching in and the other lot lurching out. And the bands would play all the time to catch the passing traffic. In an American red light district, they would call it non-stop striptease. Many of the bands that played in Hamburg were from Liverpool, Norman went on. It was an accident. Bruno went to London to look for bands, but he happened to meet an entrepreneur from Liverpool in Soho who was down in London by pure chance, and he arranged to send some bands over. That's how the connection was established. And eventually, the Beatles made a connection not just with Bruno, but with other club owners as well. They kept going back because they got a lot of alcohol and a lot of sex. And what was so special about Hamburg? It wasn't that it paid well, it didn't. Or that the acoustics were fantastic, they weren't. Or that the audiences were savvy and appreciative, they were anything but. It was the sheer amount of time the band was forced to play. Here is John Lennon in an interview after the Beatles disbanded, talking about the band's performances at a Hamburg strip club called the Indra. We got better and got more confidence. We couldn't help it with all the experience playing all night long. It was handy them being foreign. We had to try even harder, put our heart and soul into it to get ourselves over. In Liverpool, we'd only ever done 1-hour sessions, and we just used to do our best numbers, the same ones at every one. In Hamburg, we had to play for 8 hours, so we really had to find a new way of playing. 8 hours? Here is Pete Best, the Beatles' drummer at the time. Once the news got out about that we were making a show, the club started packing them in. We played 7 nights a week. At first we played almost non-stop until 12:30 in the morning when it closed, but as we got better the crowd stayed till 2 most mornings. 7 days a week? The Beatles ended up traveling to Hamburg 5 times between 1960 and the end of 1962. On the first trip they played 106 nights, 5 or more hours a night. On their second trip they played 92 times. On their third trip they played 48 times for a total of 172 hours on stage. The last 2 Hamburg gigs in November and December of 1962 involved another 90 hours of performing. All told, they performed for 270 nights in just over a year and a half. By the time they had their first burst of success in 1964, in fact, they had performed live an estimated 1,200 times. Do you know how extraordinary that is? Most bands today don't perform 1,200 times in their entire careers. The Hamburg Crucible is one of the things that set the Beatles apart. They were no good on stage when they first went there, and they were very good when they came back, Norma went on. They learned not only stamina, they had to learn an enormous amount of numbers, cover versions of everything that you can think of. Not just rock and roll, a bit of jazz too. They weren't disciplined on stage before that, but when they came back, they sounded like no one else. It was the making of them. Let's now turn to the history of Bill Gates. His story is almost as well known as the Beatles. Brilliant young math whiz discovers computer programming, drops out of Harvard, starts a little computer company with his friends called Microsoft. Through sheer brilliance and ambition and guts, builds it into the giant of the software world. That's the broad outline. Now, let's dig a little bit deeper. Gates' father was a wealthy lawyer in Seattle, and his mother was the daughter of a well-to-do banker. As a child, Bill was precocious and easily bored by his studies. So his parents took him out of public school, and at the beginning of 7th grade, sent him to Lakeside, a private school that catered to Seattle's elite families. Midway through Gates' second year at Lakeside, the school started a computer club. The Mothers Club at school did a rummage sale every year, and there was always the question of what the money would go to, Gates remembers. Some went to the summer program where inner-city kids would come up to the campus. Some of it would go for teachers. That year, they put $3,000 into a computer terminal down in this funny little room that we subsequently took control of. It was kind of an amazing thing. It was an amazing thing, of course, because this was 1968. Most colleges didn't have computer clubs in the 1960s. Even more remarkable was the kind of computer Lakeside bought. The school didn't have its students learn programming by the laborious computer card system like everyone else was doing in the 1960s. Instead, Lakeside installed what was called an ASR-33 teletype, which was a time-sharing terminal with a direct link to a mainframe computer in downtown Seattle. The whole idea of time-sharing only got started in 1965, Gates continued. Someone was pretty forward-looking. Bill Joy got an extraordinary early opportunity to learn programming on a timeshare system as a freshman in college in 1971. Bill Gates got to do real-time programming as an 8th grader in 1968. From that moment forward, Gates lived in the computer room. He and a number of others began to teach themselves how to use this strange